Nights in Rodanthe by Nicholas Sparks. Chapter 2. Adrian was in the kitchen when she heard the front door open and close. A moment later, Amanda was moving through the living room. "Mom!" Adrian set the box on the kitchen counter. "In here!" she called. When Amanda pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, she found her mother sitting at the table, an unopened bottle of wine before her. "What's going on?" Amanda asked. Adrian smiled, thinking how pretty her daughter was, with light brown hair and hazel eyes to offset her high cheekbones. She had always been lovely. Though an inch shorter than Adrian, she carried herself with the posture of a dancer and seemed taller. She was thin too, a little too thin in Adrian's opinion, but Adrian had learned not to comment on it. "I wanted to talk to you," Adrian said. "About what?" Instead of answering, Adrian motioned to the table. "I think you should sit down." Amanda joined her at the table. Up close, Amanda looked drawn, and Adrian reached for her hand. She squeezed it, saying nothing, then reluctantly let go as she turned toward the window. For a long moment, there were no sounds in the kitchen. "Mom?" Amanda finally asked. "Are you okay?" Adrian closed her eyes and nodded. "I'm fine. I was just wondering where to begin." Amanda stiffened slightly. "Is this about me again? Because if it is..." Adrian cut her off with a shake of her head. "No, this is about me," she said. "I'm going to tell you about something that happened 14 years ago." Amanda tilted her head, and in the familiar surroundings of the small kitchen, Adrian began her story. Chapter 3. Rodanthe, 1988. The morning sky was grey when Paul Flanner left the attorney's office. Zipping his jacket, he walked through the mist to his rented Toyota Camry and slipped behind the wheel, thinking that the life he had led for the past quarter century had formally ended with his signature on the sales contract. It was early January 1988, and in the past month, he'd sold both his cars, his medical practice, and now, in this final meeting with his attorney, his home. He hadn't known how he'd feel about selling the house, but as he had turned the key, he'd realized he didn't feel much of anything other than a vague sense of completion. Earlier that morning, he had walked through the house, room by room, one last time, hoping to remember scenes from his life. He'd thought he'd picture the Christmas tree and recall how excited his son had been when he padded downstairs in his pajamas to see the gifts that Santa had brought. He tried to recall the smells in the kitchen on Thanksgiving or rainy Sunday afternoons when Martha had cooked stew, or the sounds of voices that emanated from the living room where he and his wife had hosted dozens of parties. But as he passed from room to room, pausing a moment here and there to close his eyes, no memories sprang to life. The house, he realized, was nothing more than an empty shell. He wondered once again why he had lived there as long as he'd had. Paul exited the parking lot turned into traffic and made his way to the interstate, avoiding rush of commuters coming in from the suburbs. 20 minutes later, he turned into Highway 70, a two-lane road that cut southeast toward the coast of North Carolina. On the back seat, there were two large duffel bags. His airline ticket and passport were in the leather pouch on the front seat beside him. In the trunk was a medical kit and various supplies he had been asked to bring. Outside, the sky was a canvas of white and grey, and winter had firmly settled in. It had rained this morning for an hour, and the northerly wind made it feel colder than it was. It was neither crowded on the highway nor slick, and Paul set the cruise control a few miles over the speed limit, letting his thoughts drift back to what he had done that morning. Brett Blackerby, his attorney, had tried one last time to talk him out of it. They had been friends for years, 6 months ago, when Paul first brought up all that he wanted to do. Brett thought Paul was kidding and laughed aloud, saying, "That will be the day." Only when he'd looked across the table at the face of his friend had he realized Paul was serious. Paul had been prepared for that meeting, of course. It was the one habit he couldn't shake, and he pushed 3 neatly typed pages across the table, outlining what he thought were fair prices, and his specific thoughts on the proposed contracts. Brett had stared at them for a long moment before looking up. "Is this because of Marta?" Brett had asked. "No," he'd answered. "It's just something I need to do." In the car, Paul turned on the heater and held his hand in front of the vent, letting the air warm his fingers. Peeking in the rear view mirror, he saw the skyscrapers of Raleigh and wondered when he would see them again. He had sold the house to a young professional couple. The husband was an executive with Glaxo. The wife was a psychologist who had seen the home on the first day it was listed. They'd come back the following day and had made an offer within hours of that visit. They were the first and only couple to have walked through the house. Paul wasn't surprised. He'd been there the second time they've walked through, and they had spent an hour going over the features of the home. Despite their attempts to mask their feelings, Paul knew they'd buy it as soon as he'd met them. Paul showed them the features of the security system and how to open the gate that separated this neighborhood from the rest of the community. He offered the name and business card of a landscaper he used, as well as the pool maintenance company, with which he was still under contract. He explained that the marble in the foyer had been imported from Italy and that the stained glass window had been crafted by an artisan in Geneva. The kitchen had been remodeled only 2 years earlier. The Sub-Zero refrigerator and Viking cooking range were still considered state-of-the-art. No, he'd said, cooking for 20 or more wouldn't be a problem. He walked them through the master suite and bath, then the other bedrooms, noticing how their eyes lingered on the hand-carved molding and sponge-painted walls. Downstairs, he pointed out the custom furniture and crystal chandelier and let them examine the Persian carpet beneath the cherry table in the formal dining room. In the library, Paul watched as the husband ran his fingers over the maple paneling, then stared at the Tiffany lamp on the corner of the desk. "And the price?" the husband said. Includes all furniture. Paul nodded. As he left the library, he could hear the hushed, excited whispers as they followed him. Toward the end of the hour, as they were standing at the door and getting ready to leave, they asked the question that Paul had known was coming. Why are you selling? Paul remembered looking at the husband, knowing there was more to the question than simple curiosity. There seemed to be a hint of scandal about what Paul was doing, and the price, he knew, was far too low, even had the home been sold empty. Paul could have said that since he was alone, he had no need for the house this big anymore, or that the home was more suited to someone younger who didn't mind the stairs, or that he was planning to buy or build a different home and wanted a different decor, or that he planned to retire, and all this was too much to take care of. But none of those reasons were true. Instead of answering, he met the husband's eyes. Why do you want to buy? He asked instead. His tone was friendly, and the husband took a moment to glance at his wife. She was pretty, a petite brunette, about the same age as her husband, mid-30s or so. The husband was good-looking as well, and stood rammered straight, an obvious up-and-comer who had never lacked for confidence. For a moment, they didn't seem to understand what he meant. It's the kind of the house we've always dreamt about, the wife finally answered. Paul nodded. Yes. He thought, I remember feeling that way too, until 6 months ago anyway. Then I hope it makes you happy, he said. A moment later, the couple turned to leave, and Paul watched them head to their car. He waved before closing the door, but once inside, he felt his throat constrict. Staring at the husband, he realized had reminded him of the way he had once felt when looking at himself in the mirror. And for a reason he couldn't quite explain, Paul suddenly realized there were tears in his eyes. The highway passed through Smithfield, Goldsboro, and Kingston, small towns separated by 30 miles of cotton and tobacco fields. He'd grown up in this part of the world, on a small farm outside Williamston, and the landmarks here were familiar to him. He rolled past tottering tobacco barns and farmhouses. He saw clusters of mistletoe in the high barren branches of oak trees just off the highway. Lobelia pines clustered in long, thin strands separated one property from the next. In New Bern, a quaint town situated at the confluence of the Neuse and Trent rivers. He stopped for lunch from a deli in the historic district. He brought a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and despite the chill, he settled on a bench near the Sheraton that overlooked the marina. Yachts, sailboats were moored in their slips, rocking slightly in the breeze. Paul's breaths puffed out in little clouds. After finishing his sandwich, he removed the lid from his cup of coffee. Watching the steam rise, he wondered about the turn of events that had brought him to this point. It had been a long journey, he mused. His mother had died in childbirth, and as the only son of a father who farmed for a living, it hadn't been easy. Instead of playing baseball with friends or fishing for a largemouth bass and catfish, he'd spend his days weeding and peeling worms from tobacco leaves 12 hours a day, beneath a balled-up southern summer sun that permanently stained his back a golden brown. Like all children, he sometimes complained, but for the most part, he accepted the work. He knew his father needed his help, and his father was a good man. He was patient and kind, but like his own father before him, he seldom spoke unless he had reason. More often than not, their small house offered the quietude normally found in a church. Other than perfunctory questions as to how school was going or what was happening in the fields, dinners were punctuated only by the sounds of silverware tapping against the plates. After washing the dishes, his father would migrate to the living room and peruse farm reports while Paul immersed himself in the books. They didn't have a television, and the radio was seldom turned on, except for finding out about the weather. They were poor, and though he always had enough to eat and a warm room to sleep in, Paul was sometimes embarrassed by the clothes he wore, or the fact that he never had enough money to head to the drugstore to buy a moon pie or a bottle of cola like his friends. Now and then he heard snide comments about those things, but instead of fighting back, Paul devoted himself to his studies, as if trying to prove it didn't matter. Year after year, he brought home perfect grades, and though his father was proud of his accomplishments, there was an air of melancholy about him whenever he looked over Paul's report cards, as though he knew that they meant his son would one day leave the farm and never come back. The work habits honed in the fields extended to other areas of Paul's life. Not only did he graduate valedictorian of his class, he became an excellent athlete as well. When he was cut from the football team as a freshman, the coach recommended that he try cross-country running. When he realized that effort, not genetics, usually separated the winners from losers in races, he started rising at 5 in the morning so he could squeeze 2 workouts into a day. It worked. He attended Duke University on a full athletic scholarship and was their top runner for 4 years. In addition to excelling in classroom, in his 4 years there, he relaxed his vigilance once and nearly died as a result. But he never let it happen again. He double majored in chemistry and biology and graduated summa cum laude. That year also became an All-American by finishing 3rd at the National Cross Country meet. After the race, he gave the medal to his father and said that he had done all this for him. "No," his father replied. "You ran for you. I just hope you're running towards something, not away from something." That night, Paul stared at the ceiling as he lay in bed trying to figure out what his father had meant. In his mind, he was running towards something, toward everything, a better life, financial stability, a way to help his father, respect, freedom from worry, happiness. In February of his senior year, after learning he had been accepted to medical school at Vanderbilt, he went to visit his father and told him the good news. His father said that he was pleased for him, but later that night, long after his father should have been asleep, Paul looked out the window and saw him, a lonely figure standing near the fence post, staring out over the fields. 3 weeks later, his father died of a heart attack while tiling in preparation for the spring. Paul was devastated by the loss, but instead of taking time to mourn, he avoided his memories by throwing himself even further into work. He enrolled at Vanderbilt early, went to summer school and took 3 classes to get ahead in his studies. Then, added extra classes in the fall to an already full schedule. After that, his life became a blur. He went to class, did his lab work, and studied until the early morning hours. He ran 5 miles a day and always timed his runs, trying to improve with each passing year. He avoided nightclubs and bars. He ignored the goings-on of the school athletic teams. He bought a television on a whim, but he never unpacked it from the box and sold it a year later. Though shy around girls, he was introduced to Martha, a sweet-tempered blonde from Georgia who was working at the medical school library. And when he never got around to asking her out, she took it upon herself to do so. Though worried about the frantic pace he held himself to, she nonetheless accepted his proposal, and they walked the aisle 10 months later. With finals looming, there was no time for a honeymoon, but he promised they'd head someplace nice when school was out. They never got around to it. Mark, their son, was born a year later, and in the first 2 years of his son's life, Paul never once changed a diaper or rocked the boy to sleep. Rather, he studied at the kitchen table, staring at diagrams of human physiology or studying chemical equations, taking notes and acing one exam after the next. He graduated at top of his class in 3 years and moved the family to Baltimore to do his surgical residency at Johns Hopkins. Surgery, he knew by then, was his calling. Many specialties required a great deal of human interaction and hand-holding. Paul was not particularly good at either. But surgery was different. Patients weren't as interested in communication skills as they were in ability, and Paul hadn't only the confidence to put them at ease before the operation, but the skill to do whatever was required. He thrived that environment. In the last 2 of his years in residency, Paul worked 90 hours a week and slept 4 hours a night, but oddly showed no signs of fatigue. After his residency, he completed a fellowship in craniofacial surgery and moved the family to Raleigh, where he joined a practice with another surgeon just as the population was beginning to boom. As the only specialists in that field in the community, their practice grew. By 34, he had paid off his debts from medical school. By 36, he was associated with every major hospital in the area and did the bulk of his work at the University of North Carolina Medical Center. There, he participated in a joint clinical study with physicians from the Mayo Clinic on neurofibroma. A year later, he had an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine concerning cleft palate. Another article on hemangioma followed 4 months later and helped to redefine surgical procedures for infants in that field. His reputation grew, and after operating successfully on Senator Norton's daughter, who had been disfigured in a car accident, he made the front page of the Wall Street Journal.